Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. And after a few weeks away, it is really good to be back. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our online series of talks and conversations continues with our guest, Dr. Einat Wilf, and I'll introduce Einat to you in just a moment. A little housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You also have a chat facility on your screen, and you can use this if you want to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar. Finally, we are recording this event and it will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. You will find recordings of other past events there, as well as details of our future program for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Dr. Einat Wilf was born and raised in Israel. She gained a BA from Harvard, an MBA from the INSEAD Business School in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, was foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres, and has worked as a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. Serving as a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, Einat is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, economics, and education. She has written several books, including The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path to Peace, and more recently, this book, We Should All Be Zionists, which is a collection of essays. Einat joins us live from Tel Aviv. Einat, a very warm Milim welcome to you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you, Milim. So should I just start? Okay.
Please do.
So what I wanted to do with you this evening is to bring together a lot of my thinking in recent years that was ultimately encapsulated in the title of my recent book collection of essays book titled We Should All Be Zionists. I make a bold claim that hopefully I'll be able to support, that the adoption of Zionism is both a necessary path to peace and also a critical means of defending and sustaining Jewish life in the face of rising anti-Zionism. So I'll begin with discussing Zionism as a critical means for peace, and from there take it to Jewish life. So first, a little bit about how I even got to thinking on the issue of peace and the conflict and what it's really about. I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in a very kind of left-wing Labor Party affiliated family and social setting. And as a young adult in the 80s and 90s, the Labor Party was going through a transition away from socialism that marked it for many decades of its existence into increasingly being associated as the party of peace, leading the Israeli peace camp. And at the time, it had a very compelling message. And the message was that Israel finally has a path to peace. And the path to peace is based on a very simple formula of land for peace. You all know the land. This is actually, we're marking it today, June 5th. So the land that Israel captured in the Six-Day War in 1967, the Sinai Peninsula in the south from Egypt, the Golan Heights in the north from Syria, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip in the center from Jordan and from Egypt. And the notion was that Israel's Arab neighbors that went to war with it in 1948, 49, and refused to make peace with it at the end of the war, will now, with this even more dramatic defeat in 1967, will have to come to terms with Israel's existence and make peace with it. And Israel's newly acquired territorial assets could be the thing that Israel can transact, can exchange in return for peace. And this very simple and compelling formula of land for peace was very successful for a while. This was the basis for the negotiated peace agreement with Egypt. The entire Sinai Peninsula was handed over in exchange for a peace agreement with Egypt. We can discuss how much of a peace it is, but officially it was a peace agreement, and Israel handed over the entire Sinai Peninsula. And just for a sense of proportion, it's more than twice the size of Israel. So this was the classic land for peace deal. And of course, the decade of the 90s was really the decade of the land for peace negotiations. Israel negotiated with Syria over the future of the Golan Heights. Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank, which it annexed during the 50s and up to 1967. And of course, the highlight of the 90s were the direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And during all this time, this is when I can finally vote. I vote for Rabin. I vote for Barak. This is a decade of euphoria for me as a member of the peace camp. Today, many of us are cynical towards that moment, towards that euphoria. But we need to remember that it was part of a global moment. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. A lot of things that seemed impossible suddenly seemed possible. The Good Friday Agreement was signed. Apartheid in South Africa came to an end. The countries of Eastern Europe became free and over time democratic. There was a real sense of possibility around the world. And that sense also pervaded our little corner, and the idea that the conflict might finally be resolved. Shimon Peres, with whom I worked, spoke about a new Middle East. There was really kind of feeling of peace is in the air, and we're putting all these old animosities behind us. Like many Israelis, I followed with excitement when Ehud Barak, the Israeli leader of the Labor Party, directly elected on a platform of negotiating land for peace, went to Camp David. Camp David is, of course, symbolic. This is where peace was negotiated with Egypt. And basically, he put on the table in Camp David a proposal that was designed to address all the things that we were told for decades were the obstacles to peace, or the things that the Palestinians wanted and the reason we don't have peace. So what are some of these things? The first, of course, that we hear about all the time is the occupation, meaning Israel's military control of the West Bank and Gaza. Israel didn't annex the territory except for a piece that was made into bigger Jerusalem, but most of the West Bank and all of Gaza remained under military control, with the view that they will be negotiated, that their future will be negotiated. So the military occupation of those territories was going to come to an end with the establishment of a completely sovereign state of Palestine, which would border on Egypt and Jordan. And that's it. And the Israeli military would withdraw. So the occupation would come to an end. What is the other issue we often hear about? The settlements. The state of Palestine was going to emerge with no settlements. The settlements were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So there would have been no settlements in the state of Palestine. Jerusalem, East Jerusalem is often something that we hear about. Now, I grew up in Jerusalem. When people think of Jerusalem, they immediately imagine this 1 square kilometer that I fondly call Insanity Central. It's 1 square kilometer. Jerusalem, certainly after the 68 annexation, is 100 square kilometer, mostly neighborhoods, Jewish and Arab. Those 99% were going to be divided. Arab neighborhoods to Palestine, Jewish neighborhoods to Israel. But some people forget that even the 1 square kilometer was discussed. The old city was going to be divided. The various quarters of the old city were going to be divided. There were discussions about how to divide the Temple Mount above and the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall below. So the state of Palestine was going to emerge as sovereign, no occupation, no settlement, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. Basically, all that the Palestinians had to do was say yes. What does Arafat do? He walks away. He walks away, and you might say, okay, walking away, that's a negotiating tactic. But he walks away, and he's not criticized for walking away. Not even a small op-ed in a tiny newspaper by a Palestinian expat. He's not criticized for leaving the negotiations, for leaving all of that on the table. And you might say, look, criticism in Palestinian society is more difficult. But the thing is that there was plenty of criticism of Yasser Arafat. It was just criticism for having dared to negotiate. He wasn't criticized for having left the negotiations. He was heavily criticized for going to negotiate. So he walks away. He's not criticized by his people, meaning that in walking away, he realized what they wanted. And of course, some of you will remember what follows in the years 2001, 2, 3, 4, is this massive campaign of bloody massacres, which was misnamed the Second Intifada, but is really just bloody massacre by means of suicide bombings, entire family blown to bits for going to eat pizza. I remember it as the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a palpable sense that if you were leaving your home, you were playing Russian roulette with your life. If you boarded a bus, you could only hope that it wouldn't explode. Going to coffee with your friends became an act of resistance. And this also, in a different scale, repeated itself in 2008, a similar proposal from Ehud Olmert to Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen walks away, a wave of violence. And Israelis, certainly Israelis like myself from the peace camp, who are huge supporters of a two-state, who were happy with the proposal Barak put on the table and Olmert later, began to ask a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? What do they want? I mean, they clearly don't want a sovereign state. They could have had that and they walked away. They clearly don't care about putting an end to the occupation because that was on the table and they walked away. They clearly don't care about the settlements. They could have put an end to that and they walked away. And they clearly don't care about East Jerusalem. They could have had that and they walked away. Now, you might modify that and say, look, not. They actually care about all these things. But it's only that when all these things are placed on one side of the scale, imagine a scale, and on one side of it is end of the occupation, a fully sovereign Palestinian state, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem. When you put all of these things on one side of the scale, there seems to be something on the other side of the scale that they value so much more that again and again, they're willing to walk away from everything that's on the other side of the scale in order to preserve that other thing. And I began to question, what is that other thing that they value so much more than all these things? And what I remember during this time, we're talking about the early 2000s, I'm beginning to question. I end up being in many meetings with Palestinians. I began to do the research that ultimately became the book, The War of Return. And I realized that the answer was hiding in plain sight. The Palestinians, to their credit, have always told us what they value above all else. We just didn't listen, or when we listened, we didn't take them seriously. They always said what they value above all else is from the river, from the Jordan River to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, one Arab state, no Jewish state, and any borders whatsoever in that territory. They were very clear for a century. And as I said, we just either didn't listen, or when we listened, we didn't want to believe it. We didn't take it seriously. And as I was doing the research for the War of Return, as I was meeting Palestinians who made it very clear to me, I came across a remarkable quote by Ernst Bevin. You know, he was the British foreign minister after World War II. I'm sure you know he was no friend to the Jewish people, certainly no friend to the Jewish aspiration for statehood. And yet he has to go to the British people in February of 1947 to explain why Britain is reneging on the mandate that it received from the League of Nations, right? Britain receives a mandate from the League of Nations in the wake of World War I. A lot of people make a big deal out of the Balfour Declaration. That it's not important as much as the mandate from the League of Nations, because that's a unanimous declaration by the world body at the time that this strip of land is given to the Jewish people in order to develop as ultimately as a homeland, as a state, as a sovereign presence. And the British are entrusted with that as a temporary trust. But ultimately they betray that trust. I think not enough is being discussed how they betray that trust in the 30s and 40s at the moment of the most desperate need of the Jewish people, but they betray that trust. And in 1947, they basically hand over the trust back, unable to fulfill it. They hand it back to the heir of the League of Nations, the United Nations. And because he does that, because Britain does that, Britain has to explain to the people of Britain through the parliament why. And he goes on to say as follows. Now, remember, this is February 1947. There's no state of Israel yet. There's no war. There's no refugees. There's no occupation, of course. There are no settlements. All the things that we are told are at the core of the conflict don't exist yet. And yet, Bevin says in February 1947 that His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. In February 1947, he calls it irreconcilable. Why? He says there's two groups in the land, Jews and Arabs. There's no question here of religion or who the groups are. It's Jews and Arabs, two nations, two peoples, two collectives. And he says each one of those groups has a top priority. He calls it a point of principle. That's the thing they value above everything else. And he says, for the Jews, the top priority is a state. So the Jews want to establish a state. He says for the Arabs, the top priority, and notice it, he says, is to prevent to the last the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. Notice the formulation. He's not saying that the conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting a state, and we just don't know where to draw the border, so UN, please help us. He says very clearly, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. This is, by definition, irreconcilable. And it has been the best predictor of behavior of the sides ever since. Of course, it's the prediction of why Jews say yes to partition, even though they're not happy. It's half of the land they were promised by the League of Nations. It's mostly desert. It's without Zion. It's without Judea. And yet the Jews say yes because it fulfills their top priority of having a state. And the Arabs say no because it fails to fulfill their top priority of the Jews not having a state. So even though they were on the verge of having their own state, another Arab state, they still said no because their top priority was for the Jews not to have a state. And this explains all the way to the present why Arafat walked away in 2000, why Abu Mazen walked away in 2008, why every proposal for partition, even going as recently as the Trump peace plan, is met with, to quote Abu Mazen, no, no, and 1,000-time no, because none of the partition plans meet their top priority of the Jews not having a state. And this is the conflict. And sometimes I make the Bevin formulation even shorter, and I say that the conflict is actually quite simple in its essence. It might be complicated in its details, but it's simple in its essence. It's a conflict between Zionism and anti-Zionism. Now, this is not a judgment. This is a description. To say that this is a conflict between Zionism and anti-Zionism is not to say that one side is wrong or one side is right. You might very well believe that the Arab rejection of Zionism is entirely justifiable, that it is just and noble. Quite a few people believe that. But it doesn't change the fact that this is the goal, that this is the conflict. Whenever I speak on this issue, I post a video or an essay that I wrote about it. When Arabs, especially Palestinians, respond to it, they always respond by confirming the thesis. They'll say things like, of course, you're white European settler colonialists, we're going to throw you out, you're just like the Crusaders, you're apartheid, you're racist, you don't belong here. In their minds, those might be justifications for why they oppose Zionism in a Jewish state, but it doesn't change the fact that that's what they believe in, that in saying all those things, they're merely confirming that their vision is no Jewish state between the river and the sea. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, ever responds to this description by saying, what are you talking about? We Arabs, we Palestinians, we support the equal claim of the Jewish people as a people to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, and we merely want to discuss how to divide the land and where to draw the borders. That's not a response. That would be a response that would undermine the thesis. It's never brought forth. So if this is the conflict, then it also becomes quite clear how we get to peace. The conflict can only end by one of two ways. Either the Jews forgo Zionism or the Arabs forgo anti-Zionism. Now, a lot of mobilization efforts for decades, I would say a century, have been to try to get the Jews to forgo Zionism. Sometimes I describe the battle between Zionism and anti-Zionism as a century-long battle of mutual exhaustion, where each side is trying to exhaust the other to forgo their top priority. So the Arab side has mobilized war, military, terrorism, economic boycotts, international condemnations, legal efforts, everything in order to try to get the Jews to just give up, to say, look, this is not worth it. You know, the wars, the terrorism, the boycotts, the international condemnations, it's just not worth it. We're out of here. So either by a violent cataclysm or exhaustion, the idea is that ultimately comes a moment where there's no Jewish state. And that's the moment that the Arab side can say, look, we always said that they were foreigners and Europeans and white and colonialists. Notice, by the way, that all these words are basically just synonyms for foreign. And when if you say that we're foreign, then we have no connection. And the only way to deal with foreign implants, foreign invaders, is to throw them out. So once they achieve that in their mind, order is restored. The proper situation where the land from the river to the sea is Arab and there's no Jewish state is restored. I think, of course, that the far better way to get to peace is for the Arab world, and especially the Palestinians, to forgo anti-Zionism and to develop a constructive vision of having an Arab-Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza next to Israel, rather than the vision that still animates them of an Arab state instead of Israel. In parentheses, through the means of what they call a right of return. That's what I devote the book, The War of Return, to, which again is neither a right nor a return, but that's the mechanism. Now, when I said that many years ago, that seemed insane. How will the Arabs or Palestinians ever forgo anti-Zionism? That is such a tall order. Removing settlements, removing the military, that's something that we can see. But Palestinians and Arabs forgoing anti-Zionism? How can that happen? And here I am deeply thankful for the Abraham Accords for helping me demonstrate what it looks like when Arabs forgo anti-Zionism. When Jordan and Egypt signed peace agreements with Israel, those ultimately remained very frigid agreements, very frozen. They're mostly really, they're not really peace agreements. They're better understood as security, non-belligerency agreements. But the agreements with the Gulf countries were very warm ones, and they involved an ideological shift that was far bigger. It was about creating a message of Muslim tolerance and Islamic inclusion. The name Abraham in many ways reflected that. You could choose no better single word than to flip the narrative. I'm under no illusion, to be clear, the dominant narrative in the Arab and Muslim world remains that the Jewish state is a foreign implant in the region with a limited time on its existence, that ultimately just needs to be waited out. But for the first time in the history of the Arab conflict with Zionism, we have an alternative narrative that looks at the Jewish state not as a foreign implant, but as Abraham, as kin. When the Abraham Accords were signed, I became part of many groups of Emiratis and Bahrainis and Moroccans, and they asked to get talks about Zionism, saying amazingly, we feel that we've been lied to about Zionism. Can you explain to us what Zionism is? And out of these talks ultimately emerged an op-ed that I co-wrote with two young Emiratis, a man and a woman. And it opened as follows. It said, we're proud Arabs, we're proud Muslims, and we're Zionists. They didn't run away from the word. And they made it very clear that they see no contradiction between their proud Arab identity and proud Muslim identity, and a support for the Jewish right to self-determination in its ancestral homeland, basically Zionism. So the Abraham Accords began to give us a glimpse to what it looks like when the Arab world forgoes anti-Zionism. And what's interesting is I don't think it's a coincidence that the more successful countries of the Arab world are also the ones that are beginning to let go of anti-Zionism as a defining ideology of what it means to be Arab. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that I've learned about anti-Zionism is that it's an ideology of failure. I've participated in quite a few high-profile debates as to whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and I lost them all. Because what I realized is that when you make the blanket statement, anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, all the other side has to do is just kind of parade out the theological anti-Zionist Jews of Satmar or Neturei Karta, who are anti-Zionists, not because they care about anything that Israel did this week. They're anti-Zionist because they still share the Zionist vision of the restoration of the Jews in their homeland. They just think that this has to happen on God's watch and not on, on the godless Zionist watch when, the secular Zionists decide that it was time. So it's just enough to show that you have Jews who are theologically opposed to Zionism, that kind of the blanket statement of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism falls. But of course, when we discuss this, we're not really concerned about the theological opposition of Satmar Jews to Zionism. So I decided to say, okay, even though I think I made a very cogent theoretical argument as to why anti-Zionism is essentially the new mask, the new iteration of anti-Semitism, I decided to look beyond the theory and look in the practice. What happens in practice when anti-Zionism becomes a defining feature of a society, of a civilization, of a country, of a political party? And here, the verdict is clear. Throughout the 20th century and the early 21st, ever since we have anti-Zionism, it's very clear that wherever anti-Zionism rises, ultimately, there are no Jews. Exhibit A is, of course, the Arab world itself. Beginning in the 1930s, inspired by Nazi and ultimately Soviet ideas, the Arab world makes anti-Zionism into the defining ideology of what it means to be Arab. The Arab League organizes itself around the principle of anti-Zionism. And they claim all the time, as all anti-Zionists do, that it's not about Jews and they have nothing against Jews. It's just against Zionists. And yet, within a decade and a half of the Arab world making anti-Zionism into its central ideological feature, no Jews are left. And we're talking about Jewish communities that predated the Arab and Islamic conquests of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century, going back to the Babylonian exile, but no Jews are left. Complete ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world. And this time, unlike the 30s, this time in the 50s, there's a state of Israel for them to go. But that's what happens when anti-Zionism rises, despite all the protestations that it's not about Jews, there are no Jews left. The Soviet Union, of course, is Exhibit B. The Soviet Union doesn't get enough credit for its contribution, basically for creating anti-Zionism as an entire academic discipline. The Soviet Union has a long history. The Russians have a long history of giving respectability to anti-Jew hatred. They did that with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, giving anti-Semitic conspiracy theories the respectability of a book. And they did that with anti-Zionism that had to replace anti-Semitism in the wake, especially of World War II, that became the respectable academic discipline. You know, people got PhDs in anti-Zionism. Palestinian leaders like Abu Mazen got their PhDs in Holocaust revisionism, anti-Zionism, and they made it into an entire academic discipline. All the ideas of Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is racism, Zionism is apartheid, Zionism is imperialism. All of these ideas go back to the 60s and 50s in the Soviet Union. They're not new ideas. When a human rights organization publishes a report that Israel's an apartheid state, they're not coming up with a revelation. They're echoing one of the most successful campaigns that the Soviet Union exported to the European left and ultimately to the Western left. So the Soviet Union, again, claimed that it was not about Jews. They don't even see Jews. But the Jews of the Soviet Union knew exactly what was meant by Zionists. And as soon as they could leave, they left. And you've had that experience with Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is a classic Soviet anti-Zionist. He genuinely believes that as a left-wing person, he's against racism, and he doesn't see that anti-Zionism is the respectable replacement for the old Jew hatred. And again, within moments of anti-Zionism coming to define Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, it became a cesspool of anti-Jewish hatred. Jews felt that they had to leave. And I will say here, and kudos to British Jews who fought back. Because again, if we learned anything from the Arab world, from the Soviet Union, is that when anti-Zionism is allowed to run rampant and fulfill its full arc, the environment turns hostile to Jewish life, and ultimately no Jews are left. And we see that happening now in American universities, where anti-Zionist universities become places where Jews just don't go to study anymore. And then again, back to the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were able to show the exact opposite arc. Not only that when anti-Zionism rose in the Arab world, ultimately no Jews were left because the environment turned hostile to Jewish life, but the opposite. When the Abraham Accords countries became pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, they also became favorable to Jewish life. There's kosher foods on Emirates, and there's Jewish weddings now, and Emirati officials are celebrating Jewish holidays with Jewish expats. So in theory, anti-Zionism does not have to be against Jews or anti-Semitic. In practice, it always is. So here I bring it all together of why ultimately the name that I gave my book is We Should All Be Zionists. Because the only way that we end the conflict is by the Arab world dropping its anti-Zionism. You know, sometimes people in a panel or a debate think they own me by saying, oh, what, you think that Palestinians should be Zionists? And I say, yes. Why is it such a preposterous idea? Jews, Israelis are expected to support the equal right of Palestinians to self-determination in the land. Why is it so preposterous to ask that the Palestinians recognize the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in the land? They both have the right to self-determination. Neither can have all of the land, and both can have some of it in order to realize their self-determination. Recognizing the Jewish right to self-determination in the land of Israel is Zionism. That's all it is. And we see it. So we see that the Arab world letting go of anti-Zionism as a defunct ideology, as an ideology of failure, as an ideology that they had nothing to show for after decades. And when they're finally being successful, when they no longer need this crutch to direct the ire of their people, when they're successful functional governments, they don't need anti-Zionism. So being Zionist is the correct path for the Arab world, for the Palestinians to get to peace. It's the way to secure Jewish life, because again, long before anti-Zionism is a threat to Israel, it's a threat to Jewish life where Jews are. You know, for many years, I struggled with why I felt so differently about the clearly lethal anti-Semitism that comes from right-wing circles and the left-wing respectable anti-Zionism that comes from academia and journalism on the left. And one day it hit me. I realized that the lethal anti-Semitism from the right is like crime. It's something external. You know, we can all be victims of crime. It can be lethal, but we recognize it as something external to our lives. We take precautions and we hope that we don't fall prey to it. But at the end of the day, criminals, for most of us, are not our social circle. Anti-Zionism is much more like domestic violence. It uses the respectable mask of the spouse to assault you in your home, in the place that you felt you were safe. And that's where you see anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism goes after Jews in the place where Jews are, where Jews believe was their home, the social justice circles, academia, journalism. Some of these are places that Jews built. And anti-Zionism rises and goes after Jews in the places where Jews are, which is why fighting anti-Zionism is about, first and foremost, long before it has anything to do with Israel, it's about defending the ability to have thriving Jewish communities and thriving Jewish life wherever it is. And I'll end by saying that a couple of years ago, I was a visiting professor in Georgetown. I taught a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism. At the end of the course, one of my Jewish students came up to me and she said, you know, this course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy. And through the talks with her, I realized that anti-Zionism ultimately takes an emotional toll because it operates like domestic violence through the mechanism of bullying. It constantly bullies Jews to hand over I called it a pound of flesh. You know, Shakespeare had it backwards. It's mostly not the Jews who demand it. They're demanded to give it. You know, Jews are asked to constantly demonstrate that they're the good kind of Jews, you know, and whenever they hand over their lunch money to the bully and they say, yeah, I really hate Netanyahu, the bully doesn't go away. The bully comes back, and then they have to say, yeah, Israel is an apartheid state. And then the bully comes back and they have to say, yeah, Israel is Zionism, is racism. And it's just this relentless dynamic of bullying that takes an emotional toll. And what a lot of students have realized, and I've been in touch with them over the years, is that once you understand that this is a dynamic of bullying, you know how to resist it. Because bullying preys on shame. And if you're made to feel ashamed of Israel or the association of Jewish civilization with Zionism, with Israel, then it's easy to bully you. But if you're confident, the bullies go away. So I ultimately realized from my interaction with many students who came out of the closet as Zionists, is that the absolute best response to the anti-Zionist bullying is Zionism. And this is why I claim that we should all be Zionists.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Einat. If anybody has questions for Einat, please put them in the Q&A now. We have about 15 minutes left if we need it. Your arguments are very coherent. What you say makes perfect sense. It seems blindingly obvious. So why is it that most Western governments and a significant part, I think, of the Western media seem to buy the narrative that the Palestinians are hard done to and deserve their state and so on and so on? Why don't they see what they're really about?
So first of all, I would say it took me a while too, because, you know, there's a deep desire not to see it. It's so much easier to just say, you know, Israel, get out of the West Bank, or Israel, you know, don't build settlements. And it's just, that gives the satisfaction of thinking, okay, you know, this is a simple solution. When you say Palestinians need to forgo anti-Zionism, people balk. They're like, oh, okay, how will we ever achieve peace? But I call myself a long-term optimist, in the sense that people change their priorities, their worldviews, typically not easily, typically only when they have no choice, but it does happen. Of course, it doesn't happen when they're indulged in their worldview. And this is why for the book, The War of Return, I invented a word called Westplaining, which, like mansplaining, expresses the same attitude of people kind of telling other people who are perfectly capable of expressing themselves what they really mean or what they really think. So again, to the credit of Palestinians, they express themselves very clearly. And again, they've been, to their credit, they've been consistent over a century that they view Zionism as a sin, as an injustice, and as their most noble duty to fight it to the last. Westplaining is the phenomena that I've met in meeting numerous European diplomats and journalists who will say things like, oh, the Palestinians don't really mean it, or they're just being angry. Or one of my favorite examples is a New York Times video journalist who covered who covered the marches of return in Gaza a few years ago. Now, the marches were clearly called the Marches for Return. And the Gazans marched on the border with Israel. They didn't march on the border with Egypt, right? They never marched on the border with Egypt. They marched on the border with Israel in the name of return. And the journalist asked them, what are you fighting for? And they all said a variation of the same thing, pointing to Israel beyond the border, saying, this is ours. We're going to take it back from the river to the sea. They all said variations of that. And no one said anything else. And then the journalist turns to the camera and says, they are protesting the dire conditions in Gaza. And I'm thinking that's actually the one thing they didn't say. And I sometimes term it almost a neo-colonial attitude, this Western attitude that refuses to see the Palestinians and the Arabs as agents of history, as people who know very well what they're fighting for, who are very clear about their priorities, people who make sacrifices and choices because they value some things more than others, and they're not being delusional. Sometimes people tell me, oh, the Palestinians can't mean that seriously. And I always say they're probably the less delusional party in the conflict. They're looking at a map. They see 500 million Arabs. They see 1.3 billion Muslims, most of whom who are supportive of their cause. And they rationally conclude that they only need a little more time to wait us out. So they're not being irrational. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of in the book, The War of Return, is I think the book gives Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word.
Tim Friedman says, a clear and interesting disposition, but how does the speaker respond to the Arab claim that Jews are entitled to self-determination, but not in the Arab states? In other words, go to Africa and establish your state there. And I might sort of add on to that. What about Jews who say, well, Jordan is Palestine? Jordan was a significant part of the mandate. It's majority Palestinian. Is Jordan Palestine?
So the principle of self-determination, which governed the transition of the 20th century, in that sense, the 20th century is pretty simple. We begin the 20th century when much of the world is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when much of the world is basically divided between states. When lucky, those are nation states based on the principle of self-determination, meaning that the people had a say in building that state. When unlucky, outside empires drew lines in the sand and forced people together and told them, you're a state. And most of the time, these peoples, once the empire left, just descended into civil war, or a strongman dictator took over. But that's pretty much the 20th century in its transition and the principle of self-determination. Now, Zionism is built on the idea that the Jews are a people no less than the Arabs, the French, the Italians, the Slovenes, the Ukrainians. They're a people. First and foremost, I'm sure you know, the idea that Jews are a religion, certainly only a religion, is a 19th century Western construct intended to fit the Jews into the newly created political idea of the secular state and the citizen. So Judaism, certainly under Zionism, is first and foremost about belonging to a people and a nation. When I talk about Jewish history to many groups, I always tell them, look, I'm an atheist. I'm a devout atheist. I'm very Jewish. I'm very much an atheist. Only by saying that to them do I force them to contend with the fact that the Jewish identity, certainly for many Jews, is first and foremost about collective, national, tribal belonging. Now, if you accept the principle of self-determination as the principle that, at least for now, governs our political world, then the claim of Zionism is that the Jews possess that right no less than any other people. And once you accept that the Jews possess the right to self-determination, there is only one single geography to which the Jews as a people were ever connected. The Jews as individuals lived in many geographies, but as a people, they only ever were connected to one single geography, Zion, the land of Israel, hence the term Zionism. That's the only geography in which they ever governed themselves as a people. So this is the only place. There's no other places. It's not some transferable self-determination, because once you do that, then we can do it for everywhere. Arabs can do self-determination in the South Pole. Why not? self-determination, again, is about self. It's about who you are as a people. Now, in terms of Jordan as Palestine, on this thing, all I have to say is this. In the West Bank, less so in Gaza by now, it's emerging almost as a mini state. But in the West Bank, you have people who are semi-stateless, right? Palestinian declared itself a state multiple times, and you could argue that the Palestinians in the West Bank live in the state of Palestine. But at the end of the day, the Arabs who live in the West Bank and Gaza have the right to self-determination. Whether they exercise it through some kind of association with Jordan or in a separate state, I think is a secondary issue to the fact that they do have the right to govern themselves by themselves, but they first have to make that a priority, meaning that they finally have to let go of the priority of depriving the Jews of self-determination and pursuing a priority of having their own self-determination. Once that becomes a priority, the details of whether the West Bank should, if they want to be in a confederation with Jordan, if they want to exercise it as citizens of Jordan, that's for them to determine. But they first have to decide that this is their priority. And at least for the last century, that has not been the case.
We have a question from Natalie Rivlin. If Zionism is so important, that is the establishment of a state for Jewish people, then why is the state of Israel so insistent on being a country being anti-Jewish, opening shops on Shabbat, buses now on Shabbat running in Tel Aviv, basically attacking any shows of Jewishness, ridiculing Shabbat observant people? I believe Natalie has lived in Israel. I have to say, I certainly have never experienced anything like that in all the time I've spent there, but I wonder if you could comment on her thoughts.
So I'll comment it in several directions. First, of course, I don't accept this description, like you said, people being ridiculed for observing Shabbat. That's not something that happens. I mean, I don't know, maybe someone individually, but that's not a matter of the state of Israel. Maybe someone can perceive having buses in Tel Aviv on Shabbat as a personal offense, but that's not how it's meant. Then we go to the far deeper issue, the question of what it means to be a Jewish state. And I have this talk, and you're welcome to look it up on YouTube if you want, which is literally titled, "What does it mean when we call Israel the Jewish state?" And I end the talk, I go through 4,000 years of Jewish history. I look at what modernity did to Jewish life, how it basically created a lot of possibilities of being Jewish by religion, but not by nation, Jewish by nation, but not by religion, all kinds of different ways of being Jewish, conservative, reform, Haredi, religious Zionist. And ultimately, I ended by saying that the Jewish state is the one state in the world where we get to argue about what it means to be the Jewish state. And I say that as a member of the Israeli Knesset, when I was in parliament, every day in the plenary was a debate on what it means to be the Jewish state. It was officially called a debate on budget or a debate on immigration, but underneath, the question was, what does it mean to be the Jewish state? And the thing is that, as I'm sure you know, we don't have a pope. We don't have an agreed authority that says this is the right way to be Jewish or the wrong way to be Jewish. In parentheses, this is why we're such a good democracy. But our mechanism of determining what is a Jewish state is intense argument carried through the Israeli Knesset. And, sometimes people, let's say from the West, whose vision of being Jewish is very much informed by the 19th century construct of Judaism as a religion, they look at me and they're like, how are you Jewish? And I look at them and I'm like, I genuinely don't see how I could be more Jewish. I live in the land of Israel. I live in the state of Israel. I speak Hebrew. I live according to the Hebrew calendar. My profession, the things I work on, the things I think about, it's all about what it means to be Jewish. So to say that being Jewish means that there will not be public transportation on Shabbat is a claim, but it's nothing more than a claim. It's a claim to be debated in the Knesset. It's a claim to be debated among Jews in general. But whether or not we have public transportation in Shabbat does not make the state any more or less Jewish. What makes the state very, very Jewish is that we argue about this.
We've got two questions about the Abraham Accords, Howard Kleinberg and Martina Cassidy. They're essentially asking the same thing. Do you think that the Abraham Accords will be expanded or indeed survive, given pressure from Iran and Iran cozying up with Saudi Arabia?
So first, unfortunately, nothing is irreversible, and there are a lot of forces trying to undermine the Abraham Accords. There's no question. Precisely because of all the things that I said that the Abraham Accords represent. And they represent even broader issues in the Middle East. I think the Abraham Accords, in many ways, I call it collateral benefit. We're not the central story here. It's part of a bigger development and battle for what it means to be Muslim. It's about fashioning a vision of Islam that is tolerant, that is inclusive, one that can compete for young Arab and Muslim hearts and minds against the radical vision of ISIS. So there's a lot of things that are happening in which we're in many ways a sideshow. The detente, I don't know if it's still normalization, but the detente with Iran is part of it. It's all happening under the far bigger development that the United States, for several successive presidents, Obama, Trump, Biden, on that, they're all the same, has reduced its footprint in the Middle East, meaning that all the countries of the Middle East understand that they increasingly have to fend for themselves, build their own alliances. There's not going to be an American umbrella. And as part of all these alliances, countries are looking in all directions, and countries are also resisting the idea of either or America or China. You see a lot of the Arab countries refusing to have to choose, and increasingly even refusing the idea of either or in terms of being against or for Iran, looking into the possibilities of a kind of detente. And in all that, Israel will have to work and to make sure that whatever opportunities emerge in the Middle East, it nourishes them, it takes advantage of them, and doesn't undermine them. And that's certainly something, I'll put it this way, I generally tend to trust Netanyahu with that, not so much his coalition partners.
A few more questions to get through if we can. Michael Lewin is interested in attitudes of the wider Palestinian population. He feels that the extreme views held by Hamas and the politicians may well be a minority. Is there any research into what wider Palestinian society thinks? Do people in that society actually want peace?
So unfortunately, this is a very kind of comforting idea we've had for a while, that the extreme ideas are the minority, that there's a difference between the PA and Hamas, that the people are more moderate than their leaders. And one of the things that we see quite consistently, and again, all in the research for the War of Return, is that the people, the Palestinian people, and certainly the ones, a significant share who view themselves as refugees in perpetuity, are the most extreme element. Again and again refusing. As I said, when Arafat and Abu Mazen go to negotiate, they're criticized for negotiating. They're not criticized for walking away. So in many ways, Arafat and Abu Mazen were the more moderate elements. We love to tell ourselves that the Palestinians have been hijacked by extreme corrupt leaders. If anything, the corruption is maybe making them a little more moderate. It's the opposite. It's the Palestinian people who are not allowing their leaders to go beyond the circumscribed vision of from the river to the sea. And I follow this very, very closely. You know, a lot of people are dismayed by that, and I understand that. We want that comforting idea that somewhere there are very different ideas. And I meet groups, and all the time they tell me, look, this can't be the case. We hear different things. So first of all, in parentheses, by now, I don't accept any Westerner who tells me what a Palestinian thinks, because it goes through that West Plaining filter. So I always send them to do homework, and I tell them, look, bring me any Palestinian declaration, not of politicians. It can be just a random person who writes a tweet, right? The bar is very low. Where the bar is not low is I insist that it would be a Palestinian in their own voice publicly. So a video, YouTube, a tweet, an op-ed that clearly says, it's time for us Palestinians to let go of anti-Zionism. It's time that we recognize the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in this land. We understand that for peace, for self-determination to happen, we need to stop demanding to settle inside the state of Israel in the name of this idea of return. I tell them, bring me someone who says those things clearly. Don't interpret things for me. Palestinians, Arabs have the perfect ability to express themselves clearly when they want to do that. We saw it with the Abraham Accords. We saw it with Mansour Abbas in Israel. When they want to change course away from anti-Zionism, they know how to do that. To date, no one has come back. So it's actually the opposite. The day we will begin to see public pronouncements like that is the day we'll know that the Palestinian people are shifting, and that will give birth to leaders who will take a cue from their people and negotiate peace, having dropped anti-Zionism.
Right, we'll finish with two questions of people asking your view on their concerns. Firstly, Anthony Fagin, who wants to know, do you have concerns about the evangelical Christian embrace of Zionism? Could this ultimately feed into anti-Semitism? And Martina Cassidy asking, do you think the younger generations in Israel have lost the bravery and confidence of their identity and heritage in the state in comparison to the generation of the 1940s? And there we must leave the questions because we are over time already.
Certainly. And I'll say that I write a lot about these issues, and there's books and op-eds and videos. So, and you can also email me if you have specific questions. I try to answer. So on the issue of the evangelicals, and broadly speaking, Christian Zionism, at the end of the day, the Jews are a small people. Despite claims that we control the world, we don't. We're a very small people, and we need allies. And without the idea of Christian restorationism, later known as Christian Zionism, we would not have had the support of the UK at certain moments. We would not have had the support of the United States, right? The numbers in the US are not with the Jews. The numbers are with the pro-Israel Zionist, mostly Christian population. And we need to be aware of that. And I think we need to be thankful for that. I am concerned for a kind of meeting that takes place between the settler right in Israel and evangelicals around issues of settlements and land that ultimately seep. That in itself is something I'm not happy about. Personally, I think, although I don't think settlements are the reasons we don't have peace, I think they've been Israel's most wasteful project. But what we see is that it seeps into other issues, into importing Israel into issues on, they're funding things about abortions or about, family values, LGBTQ rights, which things that at the end of the day don't fit in Israel, and that I'm not too happy about. So broad support, I think, is great, and we should be thankful for. Trying to begin to intervene in shaping the character of Israel to fit a lot of other values is something that I'm more concerned about. And finally, the issue of confidence is something that is dear to my heart. For many years, I've spent my life speaking about Israel and Zionism to an outside audience. I speak to delegations that come to Israel, mostly non-Jews from all over the world. I go abroad to speak on these issues. But in recent months, especially with the protests, I said to myself, I need to start going around the country and doing it in Hebrew. A lot of the guides, the Israeli guides that listen to me with the teams that I speak to say, you know, Israelis have to hear you, because I think one of the tragedies, the biggest tragedy, I think, of secular Zionism is that secular Zionism, first of all, funded and created the very bizarre Haredi way of life that is an entirely Israeli creation of the last 40 years. It's not some traditional way of Haredi life. It's entirely funded by the secular Zionist state. And the other tragedy is that the more successful secular Zionism was in gathering the exile, in building a state, in making the desert bloom, in winning wars, the more that religious Zionism was able to claim those successes as proof of divine will and essentially grow stronger politically on the back of the successes of secular Zionism, most notably the Six-Day War, which was won by an entirely secular socialist Israel. So for me, a lot of the work that we need to do is to bring back the confidence in the genius of secular Zionism as a movement of self-determination, as a movement of self-messiahs, of people who were no longer going to passively wait for the Messiah, but decided to take action on their own. And I think the protests are beginning to touch on that. It's not a coincidence that the symbols of the protests were the flag, the Declaration of Independence, the military, the fighter pilots, really kind of the symbols and success of secular Zionism were the ones that were taken by the protesters against this government that has very, very religious and I would argue anti-Zionist elements. And essentially they're saying, we are going to confidently proclaim the classic Zionism that gave birth to the state and gave birth to so many of its successes. But I think beyond the symbols, it's important for the young generation to know their history, to be very proud of it, and to know that at the end of the day, it is the Zionists who did it and not anybody else.
Well, on that note, let's conclude. Einat, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. I'm sure we could have carried on for much, much longer. If you want to buy this collection of essays, it's available in all good bookshops. We might manage to put a link on the email we send you tomorrow as well. It doesn't take long to read and it's very, very informative. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, saving lives in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, explained in black and white photographs. So that will reach you. Might take a few weeks to get to you, but it's definitely going to be on the way, and I hope you'll enjoy that. Now, our guests for the next 2 weeks have had to postpone their talks due to personal circumstances. So the next Milim is on the 26th of June, when Yanki Fachler will be our guest again. He's spoken for us a few times before, and he is speaking about the Jewish community of Letchworth. And we do hope to resume our weekly program immediately after that. To be sure you find out about all our events, please go to our website, milim.org.uk, and sign up to our newsletter, and that way you will be the first to know. All of our online events are free, but you can make a donation to help with the costs of our webinar. There is a link in the chat, or visit the website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Dr. Einat Wilf, once again. Thank you so much, Einat.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And looking forward to seeing you all again as a future event. And until then, stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you.